Welcome to our webinar today, 5 Tips for Emerging Franchisors. I'm Michael Kupfer with Franchise Business Review, and I'm joined by Michelle Rowan, the company president. We're going to take you through these 5 tips focused specifically on brands with fewer than 50 units. So there's a few brands that we just want to say thank you to for participating in this. The brands that we invited to give us some information are brands with under 50 units that rank in the top quartile for franchisee satisfaction in the research that we've done in the past year. And we just asked them to share some key metrics around their franchise operations, their franchise development, the types of information that they're sharing with their system and their candidates, as well as their budgets and their fees that they're using. And finally, we also asked them to share some recommendations for emerging brands, as well as their #1 mistake that others can learn from. So let's start by taking a look at what we learned, and for that, I'm going to turn this over to Michelle.
Thank you, Mike. And yes, thank you to all the companies that participated. So the idea is that we want to give you stuff that you can walk away with and ideas to think about and discuss with your team. So the first thing that we want to talk about is the importance of setting expectations up front. And there's 2 pieces we see in that expectation setting that you really want to think through and understand how you want to present them. And the first is being really clear on financial expectations. So if you have an item 19, which if you're smaller, you might not have that in your FDD yet, but if you have one, make sure that the franchisee understands how to interpret the data that you have in your item 19. The other ways that you can do that, and especially if you don't have an item 19, is to give them some questions that they can ask franchisees or have general business conversations with them so that they understand how long it takes to ramp up the business, how much money that they're really going to need to get them through until the point where they can take a draw from the business or take a salary. So understanding those financial expectations, I think, will stop a lot of surprises happening, and I think one of the common things that most people hear is a lot of franchisees will go out of business because they didn't have enough funding to support themselves through that period of startup. So that's something that we really think is important. We did also create the FBR Franchisee Vision Plan. I think that's one of the handouts or a link that will be set up or sent out post-webinar. And the idea there is that it will help you kind of formulate a plan if you're not helping franchisees already. And it's really getting the franchisee to focus on what their life and their personal goals are and how their business is going to get them there. So they can tie their success or their failure of the business to what they want to get out of it. And I think it helps drive them forward in their business understanding and productivity in their business as they're ramping up. So the second type of expectations that are crucial to set up front is the level of support or involvement that they should expect to receive from corporate. And this can be tricky, especially if you are smaller or if you're growing fast, because you don't necessarily know what that corporate staff or support is going to look like. And there's two ways you can go about it. One is that you can front load your support staff in anticipation of bringing on more franchisees, which obviously has you paying salaries and having headcount that isn't producing for you yet and can be costly. So the second option, which I think is probably more commonly taken, is that you run your support staff lean, and then you add additional staff as the number of franchisees that you're supporting grows. And that's sometimes what you have to do, that's sometimes what makes sense, and there's nothing wrong with that. But if you can explain to the candidate where they're at in the number of franchisees that have come on board and what your anticipated growth is, what that will look like, it sometimes helps diffuse their frustration when they're used to talking to the founder or getting a call back immediately, how that's going to change as the system grows and how you'll have more support people in place, but it might not be the quickest turnaround. It might not always be going to the top of the management team to answer those problems or to help them out. So there's no right answer in how you support the franchisees, but being upfront about what that plan is, and also being upfront about the funding that they really need to get their business started and how much it's going to take to get the thing off the ground are easy ways to set those expectations right up front. So Mike, you want to jump into some of the data from the survey itself?
Yeah, so this is just one data point that we were looking at in relation to setting those expectations, which really starts with the initial training that you're providing to the franchisee. And you obviously want to make the most of the hours that you spend on the franchisee training, but it's not necessarily the most effective way to sit with someone in a classroom for the entire training time and then expect them to run a store properly. So we did ask the top franchisors how many hours they allocate to each of these three areas: classroom training, in-store and in-field, and online training. And we see the results here. Not all the brands are doing all three of these things, but doing some combination is definitely a best practice, and especially giving them some type of in-store, in-field training, whether that's support staff present for opening week to help the franchisee get off the ground, or maybe having the franchisee shadow a current existing franchisee prior to their own grand opening. So there's lots of different ways to mix and match this, and obviously a lot of it depends on your particular business and what makes the most sense. But make sure that you're providing the right mix and getting your franchisees best prepared to get started out of the gate and meet their expectations.
Great. So the second tip is be transparent, and I think this is always something that people say. It might have become a buzzword over the past few years, but when we initially started doing the franchisee satisfaction research 11 years ago, we would call franchisors and kind of tell them the idea was to ask franchisees for their feedback. And there was always pushback as far as, I don't want an outside company to be involved in doing this. I don't really want to know what my franchisees think because then I have to do something about it. And that has shifted so much over the last decade. And I think that the internet plays into that, the ability to find a lot of information out there, whether it's true or false, it's out there. So the more transparent you can be, the more information you can share with franchisees, the better. And I think this is with candidates and with franchisees, to be honest. But your franchisees are heavily invested into your brand and both their money and their time and their emotions into the business. So it really makes sense to show them how the brand and how other franchisees in the system are performing. So sharing financials and getting them to feel comfortable about being open, either down to the name level or just sharing top results, bottom results, average results, or a full ranking of results on what those particular KPIs are that you're looking at, so they know where they fall in the mix of that. Being able to identify who those top and those low performers are in your system also shifts the conversation and the connections that they're making with others in their system. They might start reaching out to the people that are on top to understand how are they reducing their costs, and also the people that tend to be the noisiest can be at the bottom of your performance ranking. And when that's visible, I think that it starts to lessen the sky is falling or the doomsday approach that some people take, to see that it's not like that for everybody, that there are top players, and it'll really just help alleviate or elevate the whole system by sharing what they could be doing to be at the top of the ranking. So, we have clients that share financials, they share KPIs that are important to their particular segment of business, and they also share franchisee satisfaction data that they're collecting. So they share what they're doing well and what the franchisees would like them to focus on more, and I think it just opens it up that there's nothing being hidden, and it's really an idea of we're all in this to make more money and to move the brand forward as a whole. So on the candidate side, I think that also goes back to the same first tip. The more transparent you are day one, candidates know what they're getting into, and they know what to expect when they buy into your system, and you start that relationship with a real mutual trust in each other in a good conversation. So let's jump into the data that we collected, Mike, on what people are sharing.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. And just as a side note, I know a few people joined us in the last couple of minutes, and I just want to mention again that if you have questions as we're going through any of the content on this webinar, please feel free to chat it in, and we'll set aside some time at the end of the webinar to answer your questions or follow up afterwards if we do run out of time. So getting back to the data that we're looking at here, this is just a visualization of what our top brands are sharing with their franchisees and with their candidates. And as you can see, a lot of these brands, most of them are sharing their franchisee satisfaction very frequently with both sides. And that's something you might expect from these brands since they did perform the best in the research, so they have a little bit more to brag about. But there's certainly a benefit for brands that are not quite at the top to also share that info with their candidates. And that kind of comes back to that transparency idea of letting them know that your system, like any other, does have a couple of issues, and you're aware of them and acknowledge them and are working to fix them. So that's one takeaway you can take from this. And we also see that roughly half of them are sharing their KPI data. So there's definitely a push towards that for these top brands. And the aggregate franchisee financials are being shared a lot more commonly than the individual franchisee financials, which you can understand, especially from the candidate side. Michelle was just discussing a little bit about the benefits of sharing those individual numbers on the franchisee side and letting them see who is performing the best and letting them kind of tap into those people for some best practices as well. So just wanted to let you see what these top brands were sharing with both their franchisees and their candidates. Michelle, let me turn it back over to you for tip number 3.
Yes, perfect. And it's the most expensive tip that we have today, I think. Invest wisely in technology, and we recognize that technology is a huge investment of both your time and your money. And we also know that new, smaller, emerging brands typically don't have a lot of capital that they're just throwing around. So investing in the right software is difficult to finance, but even more important that you make those right decisions from the start so you're not spending time replacing the software. So making the right investment in technology can really alleviate your support staff. We talked about most go the route of having a lean support staff. Using technology is a great way to do more with less people. It also can serve as a differentiator for you when you're talking to candidates. If they're looking at you versus a more established or larger brand in your system, the ability to share what types of technology you're investing in and how it's helping your brand is a great way to do that. And with larger companies, they have more money behind them, but it's harder to make changes. So what they have in place might have been something that was built 5 or 6 years ago. It might be clunky, it might be outdated. So giving them information about the technology that you have in place is a great way for them to kind of weigh it against a larger, more established system. And it also can help franchisees be a lot more successful at their businesses and help them in running their business. And in turn, that's going to help them validate well when they're talking to candidates and to talk up that technology. So understanding, we talked about how expensive this is and the time that goes into it. Do you invest beyond the money that you have set aside to make this easier and to help you grow quicker? Or do you stick with systems that can manage, but there's not money to upgrade? So the idea is to anticipate what those needs are and to really work on scalability. So what technology can you afford and use now, but also potentially grow into as you start taxing it with more users on it? So we asked the people on the survey about what technologies that they're using and they're investing in, and Mike's going to share those with us now.
Yep, so you can see right here there were 6 different technologies that we asked about, plus a category for other, which some people did fall into. But this is just, these percentages are just the frequency of these top brands using these particular types of platforms. So a lot of them are using intranet first and foremost. And many of these brands, I guess one thing we can look at is the franchise ops platform. Many of them have made this investment into one of those platforms like FranConnect or FRM Solutions, which can be pretty costly, but they also create a lot of efficiencies within the system. And that's kind of going back to the idea of investing wisely, where that's going to be a big painful check to write, but it's also going to create a much more efficient system going forward. So just kind of figuring out when the right time is for that is really a key decision and key investment for your brand. And one of the things we're actually surprised about, or at least I was that only 54% are using a CRM platform, which I thought would be a little more prevalent, but some brands are able to kind of follow up with their customers and their prospects in other ways, and the CRM is not quite as high a priority. So that was just kind of an interesting note for me. If you feel like any of these systems really could benefit your brand and you think the timing might be right to make the investment, we are happy to make a few recommendations on which platforms to look at, or maybe connect you to a client that we might have that uses them, so you can get an idea of how they're working. So definitely feel free to reach out if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, it can be scary, so talking to people that have used it before is definitely can help ease your mind. So our fourth tip is to fix cracks in your system before spending money on recruitment. We work with almost over 900 brands, almost 1,000 brands, and so we know who's got strong satisfaction and we know who doesn't. And we don't share that information publicly, but we attend the expos, and when we see someone that has lower scores and they are spending money on a booth, sometimes a double booth, sometimes this huge display to lure people in, it seems so crazy to me that they're doing that, because spending any money to grow your brand, spending it on trade shows, marketing, advertising, it's really throwing money away, because if you don't have a strong foundation of current owners that are making money and are profitable and are happy, they are going to kill all those deals in validation. And you're setting unrealistic expectations, which goes back to some of the first points that we made. So you're going to spend all this time with people. You're going to find people that are the right fit that you want to grow with, but they're going to walk away once they start talking to existing franchisees if they're not validating well. So I don't think it's common anymore for any candidates to jump into a system without talking to franchisees and without using the internet to search out your brand and what people are being saying about it, both from a consumer side and a franchise owner side. So it's okay. You're going to have issues and cracks, and franchise systems are always changing and growing. So I don't think there's anything wrong with having some things that you're working on and to own that. But if you know that there's major issues, if you know that your franchise owners aren't profitable, it's time to focus on them and really make sure that you have a solid foundation for that business before you start trying to bring more people on to grow it. So with that, we're going to jump into the data as far as budgets.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. And so what you see here is 3 different budgets that our top brands have as a % of their total gross revenue. So we actually asked for that information all separately. We asked what their gross revenue was, and we asked them what they're spending on technology, on marketing, and on development. And we kind of broke that down into this simple little graph here. So about 2% on technology, roughly 8% on marketing, 3% on development. And of course, that's going to vary from brand to brand depending on what your priorities are at the time. And technology, kind of as we mentioned earlier, is one that really might fluctuate year over year, because those major technology investments are going to often involve a big lump sum in 1 year to get started, and then that kind of tapers off going forward. But you can see how these top brands are using their budgets relative to the total revenue. And you might notice that operations is absent from this graph, which it's partially because it's difficult to get a consistent definition of what an operations expense is. Some things are obvious and some things less so, so to get that same definition from each brand might not be totally accurate. And it also really does depend on your business model and your most pressing needs, which, as Michelle was just saying, if you don't have good validation and you're having problems in your operations and with your franchisee engagement, that really is a priority. And regardless of what other brands are doing, you want to focus on that and bring the validation back to where it needs to be, not just the validation, but the engagement as well, so that when you're spending this money on marketing and on development, it's not going to waste. But this was just kind of to give you a general idea of how much of the total revenue these brands are spending in these areas. And kind of on the topic of development, one other thing that we asked about was where the money is being spent on development and what the top lead sources are for these top emerging brands. So we asked with these options what the top 3 were, and the percentages are just how frequently one of these was chosen as one of the top 3 lead sources for each brand. So the brand website, almost everybody chose that, and it makes sense because your website's going to bring you a lot of pre-qualified leads, because many of the visitors to your site have sought you out and are already interested or know the brand, so that makes sense. Plus, you don't have to pay for the leads that come right through your website. Franchisee referrals was another popular one, and that's something that we often hear, that leads that come from existing franchisees are the best quality. They're not always the easiest to come by in terms of quantity, but one way to do that we really recommend is having an incentive program for your franchisees, so offering them some kind of reward or at least some kind of acknowledgement through the system for bringing in a new franchisee who signs an agreement and opens up. And that can be a great way to really inspire those franchisee referrals. So we were happy to see also that some of these brands chose FBR50.com as one of their choices, which is the listing page that we have for franchisee satisfaction award winners. So some of those brands are getting great leads through there. You see some of the other category includes some print advertising, advertising in our publications, PR efforts, and also from their current customers. And as well, there's some that have managed to get some good leads from the live events where they're meeting franchise candidates in person. And those really seem to work better for some brands than for others. And that might just have something to do with the sales team as well and their approach at those shows. So just kind of giving you an idea of where franchise brands are finding the best candidates and where their best leads are coming from. And so now back to you, Michelle, for tip number 5.
Yes, and this is also my favorite photo in our tips. So involve your franchisees, and this is going to come up when we talk about the recommendations that our top brands also make. But ask your franchisees what they think, involve them in things, and have them involved on the early end of making major decisions and investments so that it will roll out a lot easier. So I think Mike is going to share another slide next as I talk about this, but there's so many ways to get involved with your franchisees, one of them being that you can form peer groups. You can ask for people to join committees and strongly urge them to work on projects, maybe even ones that they're a little bit skeptical of, so they're more involved in the process of how you're vetting that vendor or that change that you're making. Invite franchisees to test out new technologies or systems or products that you're thinking about rolling out, and then you can use not just data that you're collecting from how it's impacting their business, but use their testimonial. Let them tell other franchisees what they like or don't like about it. And ask them to present at your annual convention. Franchisees like to be called out for their contributions, and it's a great way to allow the message to sink in from another source, not just a corporate mandated change, more that the franchisees are asking for something and you're delivering it. And it's important to give them an opportunity to provide regular feedback. And that's through surveying, and that's whether it's with us or an internal survey. You can make them short and sweet after different things that you're doing with them, conference or initiatives that are rolling out. But it allows you to gather feedback and make sure that you're on the right track, and then keep tying all the new initiatives and changes back to their feedback, that this came from their request or their need for something different to run their business. So that feedback that you get, I know when I talk to clients, and our survey is a combination of multiple choice and open-ended comments, they love reading through those open-ended comments because it's really valuable insight about the system and what's working and what's not. So all of the brands that participated in our research for this webinar solicit feedback at least annually through our survey, if not doing more things in between. And from what Mike has up here, you can see there's a big difference in the franchisees that feel that they're involved in the overall satisfaction. They're ranking much higher than the rest of the systems that we've worked with. And we actually share our questions. So if you're not ready to do something with an outside company, we'll show you what's on our standard questions so that you can at least start asking those questions and getting a feeling about that.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. And I don't have a whole lot to add to what you just said, but just in terms of the slide that we're looking at, the 72.9 and the 53.3 are what we call FSI scores, which is just an index that we use. It's basically a weighted percentage. So if you can think of it sort of in terms of 73% of the top 25% of brands, their franchisees are agreeing with this statement that they're involved in important decisions, where 53% are answering for the lower 75. So it is a really significant difference, and that involvement of franchisees really leads to better satisfaction and trust in the brand, which in turn leads to better engagement, better performance, and validation as well. And so,
Absolutely.
Michelle, I'm gonna turn it back to you. And we mentioned at the top that one of the things that we asked about was the number one mistake that brands made and what recommendations they have for other emerging brands. So you might want to go through a few of those and let people know what the top responses were.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is, this is the goal if you can avoid doing something. So the biggest mistakes, I'll start with those. So one of them was not getting the spouse involved in the decision up front. So that can kill a deal or just cause a lot of strife on the franchisee as they come on board. So getting the spouse involved is definitely something you want to do. Preparing or making sure that they prepare financing as early as possible. A lot of people don't have that conversation until later in the development process. Bring that up front and make sure that the franchisee candidate knows what they can afford and what they have access to. Prepare the business entity to purchase the franchise as quickly as possible, and that they have the funding to do that and make it through. So the next mistake that someone mentioned was starting the business with a business partner when that was the wrong person. So just make sure you know who you're getting into business with, or do it on your own, whichever makes the most sense. Wasting money on different advertising platforms without knowing what works best for my business. So I think not only is it important to measure results of anything that you're doing on the development side, but also there's so many events that you can attend and ask others what's working for them and what's not. And I don't think that everything works the same for each company, but I think that if you can talk to people that are in your category, if you can see where they're spending their money, that's a good indicator that it's something that you should try. Understanding a prospect's limitations. So a lot of people do different surveying, personality, characteristic tests. All of those are great, and some base their decision on them. But being able to offer a franchisee insight into where they might be lacking or what their strengths are versus their weakness, so that they can hire to help with those weaknesses that they don't necessarily have that skill set for their business. Underestimating the difficulties of supporting an isolated location. So I think that comes out on the recommendation list as well, is smart growth. So kind of balloon out from where you're located so that you can get to people and support them as you grow, instead of being a Florida-based company and having your first franchise in Washington State. That will not be an easy relationship to support for any type of business. And then the other is relying on brokers for too long. It drives up the cost per sale, and as soon as brokers are a great way to help you start growing your system, but as soon as you can figure out that piece and bring it in-house or have an outside development team help you do that, your cost per sale will go down a lot. So those are the mistakes, and then just quickly I will go through the recommendations, and then we can take some questions if we have any time. First is recommendation: double your estimated cost associated with being a franchise, and then triple the amount of time allocated for state registrations. So that was one. Second part of that is only register in states that you've identified as key markets, and hold off on all the rest until you have potential and interest in those states. So that's a good one because it can get expensive. Build cash so that you can invest in innovation when there's a lull in recruitment and support needs. Keep your franchising recruitment standards high and make the right long-term decision for your brand when it comes to prospects. And I think that goes to focus on the long-term goal. If the candidate's not a right fit, let them go. There's nothing that's going to turn them into the ideal candidate. And I think a lot of people regret the first 3, 4, 5 franchisees they sold to, that it was done because there was interest and not because it was the right fit. Know who your target franchisee is. We've learned who our best franchisees are, and we want to find others just like them. So that's a great one. So that goes along to that screening and profiling and finding out what your top franchisees are doing out there. And then the last one is seek out opportunities to get your franchisees engaged in your direction and have clear lines of input and buy-in in your process. We use franchisees on our board, menu test locations in field, and have monthly contact with our menu department. So this system is very much involved in testing out the product before they roll it out to the whole group. Open mic sessions at all conference calls, regional meetings, and annual conferences. Hands-on approach from your corporate team with struggling franchisees. When they see someone start to decline, they increase visit frequency and calls and really try to get them back on track. So I think those are some great recommendations to share, and I'll close out with that. And I don't know if we have any questions, but we'll wrap it up pretty quick.